So good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this very special showcase looking at the 2023-24 Major Incidents Report. My name is Margaret Morton, and I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to once again be your host today. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from Naarm, or Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I often host from my home, which is on the Wathaurong lands, also of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you're all from, and I encourage you to pop in the chat if you'd like to, the lands you are coming from today, across Australia and representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I welcome anyone who's attending the event who is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, or in fact Indigenous from any other neighbouring country. Sometimes we have Kiwis, so welcome to our event. I pay my respects to all of your elders past, present and emerging, and I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connection to the lands and the waters across Australia. And I acknowledge that they have over 60,000 years of living on one of the most extreme climate continents on the planet, geotechnical events, and there is so much we can learn from listening to and walking alongside Indigenous people. This is the 8th in a series of major incidents reports, so we produce them annually. It's only the only publicly available national digest of the incidents that occur across Australia. And we and many of our stakeholders value this report for that very reason. From our stakeholder survey, we actually know that people use the Major Incidents Report for a number of reasons: funding and policy pitches, understanding interjurisdictional approaches and their variations, volunteer engagement activities, often conducted by units and brigades at the community level, as well as general research and reading. It's continually evolving, and it's taking an increasing focus on lessons observed, and our readership is also growing. So you might be interested to know that we had 252 downloads or reads of the 2021-22 report, and now we have over 1,300 for the 22-23 report. And I'm really tempted to say, let's see if we can smash that out of the park for this report. Today we showcase all the elements of the report, from the general overview to the national overview, and followed by a chat about the Barkly Complex Bushfire in the Northern Territory. So I'll come to our speakers in just a moment, but before I do, we have some brief housekeeping. So today's event is being recorded and it will be made available to all of you along with the presentation slides. Today we're using the Q&A feature on Teams to take questions, so I'll remind you a couple of the times through the afternoon, but by all means pop your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Don't use the chat. The chat gets buried in a lot of information, so do pop them in the Q&A. You'll be able to upvote your favourite questions, and I'll do my very best at the end of the presentations to ask some of our most popular questions of the speakers. I do encourage you to use the chat, as you are doing so, to share any thoughts or reflections, to say hello, and we will also use the chat to pop CVs of our speakers and to pop in some useful links that you might find helpful. And finally, I would like to remind you to just be respectful of one another and of our presenters when posting your comments or when putting any questions in the Q&A. So without further ado, I might introduce our first speaker, Darryl Glover. He's our Major Incidents Report writer and an Emergency and Disaster Management Advisor. Over to you, Darryl.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's again a pleasure to be here this year. This is my second year as writer. We learned a lot from the first one, I did personally, and hopefully I was able to communicate those learnings into the second report. I'll jump straight in. So the report writing process, it takes about 6 months when we first start getting in place, through to now, actually maybe even 7 months through to this point in time. I come in as the writer to prepare the draft, which itself is then refined, of course, by the magnificent communications team here at AIDR and review from NEMA. So what are major incidents? So basically the major incidents report picks up on the, my apologies. Major incidents reports are those events which are significant to any of the jurisdictions. They can be at state, territory, national, but and occasionally even at local levels when we have actually something that's a little bit unique. They reflect a level of damage or disruption, again, sometimes by scale, sometimes by uniqueness. There's an element of community sentiment within the structure, so how people respond, how it sits within their tolerance, how the media actually picks up on some of our events. As I just mentioned before, so the uniqueness. So what's emerging? What are we trying to see? Starting to see trends in that we might not have seen previously. Next slide. So for this year, after consulting with each of the different agencies and authorities that might have had who coordinate or are key responders, because this is a response-based report, 30 key incidents were identified across the nation, and internationally. So we're not just restricted to what's happening here in Australia, but how Australia also participates internationally with our close neighbours, but also with key partners overseas. So out of those 30 events, we have 5 case studies. They come from Queensland, Northern Territory, Victoria, and WA. And this time we, again, including within our 30 incidents, we've tried to expand that context each year to really start to pick up on the broader hazards. And this one is one of the key things this year was the first time we included a heat-based study, and that's come out of Western Australia. And that's probably a fairly unique element too, because it's also the Department of Health, which was the hazard management agency for that event. And again, their contribution brought a little bit of different insights into how different parts of our sector work. Next slide. It'll be no surprise to those who are probably on the event this year or participating in there, because most of you would have experienced it. And for those who are overseas, you would have experienced potentially similar things. But climate has played a major part in the 23-24 sequences of events. We can see from both of these bomb maps here, a first one on our left, which is the Bureau of Meteorology's July 1st, 2023 to June 30th, 24. This is the media temperature for Australia. And if you're in Western Australia, you have experienced this significantly the highest on record mean temperatures for the year. Also in Central Australia and parts of the New South Wales coast. That in itself brings a lot of energy to our systems. And then you'll also see on the right-hand map, this is the rainfall records for this year. And you'll see, again, the extreme range that we have here from the lowest on record, again, on the west coast and the northwest coast and the south coast and parts of Tasmania, and the highest on record, or very much above average, for a large portion of the Northern Territory and Northern Queensland. One of what we assume here, and what sort of speaks about within the climate conversation chapter within the report, is that this brought a lot of diverse energy into our systems, which have driven a number of this year's major events in storms, fires, and heat waves. Next slide. As I sort of iterated, as mentioned before, we're not really just only, of the 30 events that we spoke about, it's not necessarily just our traditional natural hazards, weather-driven events. We've seen this year, extra geological, health, technological, structure. We've thrown a structure fire one there as well. That's particularly to do with the first case of a lithium battery runaway structural fire incident with fatalities in Australia, conflict, and transport incidents. So it's not necessarily just about how we might think about natural hazards. And I'm sure there's actually a number of others. There's actually quite a broad range of different hazards there that we've included in this year's descriptions. We'll see from there that some of those have an international, national, or a state-based context. You know, there's no really winners here, and everybody's, you know, some places are bigger than others, and so you don't necessarily read too much into that. But we can see that bushfire for major incidents were, you know, they won. There was 9 of those that were listed for this year. Floods came in second with that's riverine floods with 4 major incidents. Storm events, again, that energy in the atmosphere. We had 5 major events from storms and 4 cyclones. That's sort of on the natural hazard side of things. Importantly, the heat wave as a health hazard this year was included, but also the conclusion of the COVID-19 declarations is in there as well. A number of technological events, which included a cyber attack on the ports system of Australia and a major breakdown of communication system. Conflict, supporting repatriation from Hamas-Israel conflict was a major process there. And then a unique transport event that, again, remote, included hazardous materials on the boundaries of multiple states, and sadly included a number of fatalities. So you can see we actually got quite a bit of diversity in this year's profile of events that are discussed. And within them, when you go to the report, you'll see that what we tried to ask people to contribute is really about who, what, when, where, and how these events occurred. Not necessarily in the learnings first up, because that's in those documents, the learnings we picked up within our case studies. So we've popped to the next slide, thank you. And this is just reflecting on that. So this is our distribution for the year. And again, it just sort of, we can see there how overseas we've supported the landslide event in Papua New Guinea, significant contribution to Canada and Alberta and British Columbia. I think over 700 people participated within that response, and a localised level support to Vanuatu with their cyclone that occurred there. Statewide, there is another, you'll also see another table within the report about the timelines for these different events. And it'll be no surprise to people when they look that in the north of the state we had a number of fires early in the year, as it moved then through to floods, and actually as the weather conditions for those hazard periods moved across the nation generally from north to south. As I previously mentioned, I think one of the unique ones for this year was the heat wave event out of Western Australia, for which we have a case study, which is certainly well worth reading. We have a case studies for the Barkly Complex, which was spoken about a little bit later. And again, great insights into what it takes to the complexities of a large and remote event impacting on national infrastructures. We have a case study there on the storms that impacted the Queensland southeast corner over Christmas and New Year of that year, and unfortunately, again, 7 fatalities in that complex set of events that occurred there. We have a case study on Victoria, and again, a complex set of storm, fire, and flood event, all occurring within in a very short time frame, and a major disruption to infrastructure that occurred within that. So you'll see all of these case studies are sitting within the report. The intent of that case study is to not only describe what happened, but also using generally the lessons management systems of each location, each jurisdiction, to then try and communicate those learnings and those improvements that are being made from those events. So that's pretty much what's within the report this year. Please, have a look for yourself. enjoy it. And I'd just like to thank everybody that's made those contributions. Quite literally, there's a lot of backwards and forwards, and a lot of people putting a lot of time and thought into bringing that and helping us each communicate and understand what we've learned from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Darryl. It really is a good read, so I recommend everybody have a look. Now, if you do have questions, don't forget the Q&A is the spot to put them, and we'll hope for time at the end to ask them of Darryl. So please welcome our next speaker for today, Joe Buffone. Joe is the Deputy Coordinator General, Emergency Management and Response Group at NEMA. Welcome, Joe.
Yeah, good afternoon, Margaret, and good afternoon, colleagues online. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to this report, and I also commend you to read it. Every year, NEMA commissions this report with AIDR, and I want to acknowledge the partnership and the work that is done there and the steering committee. And as has already been said, it's a great collection of data on a range of very significant incidents that actually provides, some insights, observations and insights that we can then translate into making sure that we learn, we understand, and we start to adapt our systems. So that's a little bit of the theme that I want to touch on is, what does this mean and how is that aligned to some of our thinking? So if I go to the next slide, there were some themes that actually came up. So common themes for this report, and you've already heard, increasing in temperature and rainfall. So we saw that, protracted, and in actual fact, last year, the majority of damage and impacts on community was actually from low pressure systems or tropical lows that had basically de-energized from tropical cyclones and then had huge impact. And unfortunately, though, our remote Indigenous communities were overrepresented in those impacts. But then what you see there, and this is the thing around thinking through systems thinking, is that the interaction between the transseasonal rainfall, vegetation growth, and fire scale in semi-arid environments. So in one aspect, we're looking at flooding, rain, impact on communities. Then we've got this direct consequence of that in the environment. The disruption to traditional weather-driven hazard seasons, and we see, longer seasons. We saw it shift into different areas. So again, just reinforcing that our traditional models have been disrupted by climate-driven changes and climate-driven events. The vulnerability of lifelines, so that supply chain, incredibly significant when you start to see rail systems out consistently, major highways out, inaccessibility that is beyond what our normal planning cycle would be. In particular, in remote areas, they are well versed in preparing for the wet season, but this took way beyond what that actually impacted, and we saw significant power outages, which then has, again, flow-on consequences. The value of resource sharing across jurisdictions, resource sharing across governments, and resource sharing internationally. And you heard some of those examples of support. Some of the biggest offshore support from a fire perspective, the PNG support. So you saw that. The increasing complexity, and I'm actually going to touch a little bit on complexity and what we really need to think, change our thinking. And one thing is that is a theme throughout, and it definitely has come up, is around warnings, information, and messaging. And I'm on a little bit of a soapbox at the moment because I believe that we can save more lives, reduce harm, and uphold public trust by good warnings, good messaging, and good information out to communities, in particular when our resources, our physical resources, get stretched. Next slide, thanks. So I wanted to touch on this heuristic diagram, and many of you would know Mark Crosweller and You may not know Tazeket, who did a whole lot of research. And this is actually a heuristic diagram that we've adapted to actually look at how our systems are built and where the change is actually taking us. And the y-axis is about capability and capacity. The x-axis is about the severity and consequences. And I'll be fairly quick on this, but in a very, very basic sort of example, our system is built on what we know. Our capabilities on the left-hand side are very much around historical understanding and what our systems can actually scale up to meet the demands of events that we have historically been comfortable with. We get to around the severe level where we end up with an equilibrium, or we actually have more demand coming on. And as we start to move to the right, then the demand of the event overtakes our capability and capacity. And that actually increases exponentially. And in actual fact, our capability starts to drop off. So those gaps there, what we have to work out is how we optimize existing capabilities within the system. Now, a lot of what you saw in the report is very much on the left-hand side, or just starting to push into the severe. However, what I would say to you, had they have lined up in a slightly different sequencing, so consecutive, concurrent, and the compounding effects of those events, we could have very quickly pushed into the right-hand side of that heuristic diagram and then ended up in a new paradigm. And once you end up in the new paradigm, the event and the circumstances and our arrangements actually are having to deal with a novel crisis. And then we end up in the VUCA environment, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So I wanted to frame that because a lot of the work that we are doing collectively and from a national perspective is very much around how do we prepare for the right-hand side of that heuristic diagram. Because the left-hand side, well-versed. We are as good as anyone in the world in our technical capability to fight fires, to deal with floods, and to deal with a range of other hazards. But in terms of dealing with the consequences of it, slightly different thing. Next slide, thanks. Now, the report actually came up with around the complexity. You know, the common theme was around increasing complexity, in particular around remote areas, incidents, increasing challenges for response and relief activities. But I would also argue that it's increased challenge to our whole economy, to our whole supply chain system. And you saw another theme was supply chains. So a key point, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there is a significant difference between complicated and complex. And if anybody's heard of the butterfly theory around, you know, a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon, creating a tornado in Texas, that is complex adaptive systems, and that's what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with linear systems, which are complicated. And I just wanted to just put that thought, and again, I'm not going to speak too much on this, but an emphasis of what that looks like on the right-hand side of that heuristic diagram. And if we go to the next slide, so our systems quite often are built in hierarchical models and linear systems, but in actual fact, this is what they look like. They're actually networked. And this is actually modeling both FEMA and the US government in how they interact. But on any of the documents, on any of our systems, they are built in a hierarchical model. And again, in line with what we're dealing with, how we adapt our systems to think in complex adaptive systems thinking is something that I think we need to start to shift towards. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been doing, and National Coordination Mechanism is actually built on that model. It's not a hierarchical system. We actually bring together in companies, non-government organisations, government entities together to work through shared situational awareness, rapid problem definition, who has the equity and the capability to actually stabilise some of those elements, and then work through a series of other systems. So that network of network concept, the key thing here is that it is a partnership. It is shared responsibility and shared influence around how we actually deal with the problem. To date, we've ran about 660 of those since March 2022. CrowdStrike is a more recent one, and there's many, many others. Next slide, thanks. Another key thing, we've worked with natural hazards research around what is good practice to manage catastrophic crises. And we've done a literature review and looked at what good practice is. And there's a couple of key points here that, and I think going back to the major incidents report, and when you saw what Darryl actually presented, when you look at it through a national lens, you need to have that nationwide approach. When you're dealing with some of the companies that deal with supply chains, they deal through that national aspect. Another key one that I'll touch on, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but collaborate, for a collaborative and coordinate approach. That's different to command and control. So collaboration, coordination, and communication gives you significant leverage to actually deal with complex events. Another important one around decentralized decision-making and distributed execution, but centralized strategic coordination. So it is, again, a different model of how we need to think. Next slide. And I'm pushing through these because I really want to get to the example and then the conversations. Again, a shift from hazard management to consequence management. We are very good, as I said, as good as anybody in dealing with hazard management. Consequence management is very, very different. So the so what, we always have to keep asking the so what. It's raining, so what? It's flooding a particular area, so what? The roads are cut off, so what? And this is really important when we start looking at impacts on community. And as I highlighted, unfortunately, remote Indigenous communities were way overrepresented last year around flooding, around being taken off country. They are significant consequences on community impact. Next slide. Another key focus is around anticipatory analysis or strategic foresight. And I would comfortably say that we don't do this well in our system collectively. And I've spoken to operational heads and level 3 incident controllers, and I am a level 3 incident controller, and they will actually say that their planning cycle is 24 hours, 48 hours, and max 7 days based on a resource cycle. So part of strategic appreciation, strategic planning, and strategic foresight is to look way beyond that and have a big focus on consequences. And when Tony presents on the Barkly scenario, you will see this in practice. Next slide, thanks. So this is an example. I'm not going to speak to it because Tony will actually speak to it, but this is some of the products that CASP can actually produce. Next slide. And I'm going to quickly push through this because there has been changes at the national level around the Australian Government Crisis Management Framework. You know the system as it operates in states and territories, and if you're from the Commonwealth, you understand how the Commonwealth operates. But we are a federation. States and territories have primacy around emergency management, response and recovery, but how we bring the system together with the Commonwealth or the Australian government, this pretty much gives you the heart of it, how it operates. Key focus areas, National Cabinet at the political level and the National Coordination Mechanism that I've already touched on. Next slide. The other key focus here is we have gone into a tiered approach at the national level. So tier 1 and 2 are sort of like the, what I would say is the left-hand side of the heuristic diagram. Tier 3 and 4 are the more complex events, and tier 4 is pretty much catastrophic. The big change is NEMA is now responsible for tier 4 events regardless of the hazard. So what that means is we work with the departments, we work with whole of government, and we work with states and territories to provide that national oversight. Next slide. I've already touched on the National Coordination Mechanism, so we'll go past that, please. Next slide. I just wanted to touch on a range of different capabilities, again, trying to look forward. So near real-time situational awareness, and again, a big focus in the major incidents report was around understanding what was happening, and this gives a retrospective vision or insight into what that near real-time situational awareness was. Decision support, using data, using intelligence, Using systems of analytics and critical thinking, absolutely, critical to actually do that. Physical capabilities that can be shared nationally and resource sharing through the National Resource Sharing Centre, but also at the national level and internationally. Drawing on capabilities across all aspects of government, but private sector and community, and then utilising private sector in a way that we've not used before. Next slide. So that pretty much wraps up. What I wanted to do is to highlight, the major incidents report, when you look at it through the lens of how it's been presented, and then you look at the complexity and some of those drivers, I'm just encouraging us all to start to think a little bit different around how our systems need to operate, how we need to scale, and in particular, how we need to adapt. Because I think that adaptation is one of the key things that we can do right now. Thanks, Margaret. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Couldn't agree more. Much to discuss, and I can see the questions are starting to come in, so thank you for that. Welcome if you've joined us. I can see the number in attendance growing as well. So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much, Darryl. We have one more speaker, so let's move to our case study. Tony Fuller is the Chief Fire Control Officer, Bushfires NT, and he's going to share with us some information about the Barkly Complex fire.
Yeah, good morning. It is still morning in the NT, so sorry for the afternoon, people. But yeah, look, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on the Barkly Complex fire. Go straight to the next one. Some of the topics I'll cover for you, I'll just give you a quick overview of the fire summary, put some context into the NT, explain a decadal event, what that is for us, give you an overview of what the 2023 season looked like for us, the timeline of this particular fire, and then I'll show you a couple excerpts from NAFI, what our response was using NEMA, some of the lessons learned, and then the AFAC Barkly review, and just finish it off with some figures of what actually we did. That photo you can see there was taken when we put in a backburn, and the backburn actually joined in with the oncoming fire. It was a pretty significant event when that occurred. Yep, next one, please. So the summary of the fire, it actually started on the 29th of August and it went right through to the 18th of October, so 57 days. Started in two locations. One was on the Barkly Highway, and then the second fire started out at a place called Epinara Station. We later established that the Barkly Highway one was a tyre on a trailer that blew out and went off to the side of the highway. And then the second one was someone actually cooking a bush turkey, and the campfire escaped, and the two fires eventually joined on the 5th of September, and then it was called the Barkly Complex. Yep. So over 2.8 million hectares in area. And it threatened the communities of Tennant Creek, Canteen Creek and Epinara. Also had huge impact on Epinara, Aninawa, Phillip Creek and Tennant Creek pastoral stations. Yep, thank you. So some context for Bushfires NT. We have 37 permanent employees right across the NT. Only about 13 of us are operational firefighters. However, most employees can and do go out in the fire ground at different times. 400 volunteers, but the majority of them are in Darwin. I think there's probably less than a dozen in Tennant Creek where this fire started. And each year we set up an IMT at the headquarters at Acacia. It's basically a territory-wide IMT. We monitor fires right across the territory from about May. Normally we finish in about October, but the last couple of years we've gone right through to Christmas, and we're looking like we're going to go past Christmas again this year. We recruit a level 3 incident controller and other staff to supplement that IMT, mainly because we just don't have the staff to do it. So we'll recruit someone to come in, run as the IC, and they'll work 6 days and we'll cover the other 3 days just so we can get on with our normal business as well. We also recruit seasonal firefighters, and that's mainly in the top end. But those firefighters we've kept on, and we've kept a few on this year as well as the as the season progresses into the south. Yep. So bushfires areas of operations, we've got 5 areas that we break up: the Arnhem, Vernon, Arafura, Savannah, Barkly and Alice Springs. In the NT, the control of fires is the responsibility of the landholder. They're meant to do what they can to control the fire leaving their property. If they can't, then they are to contact their neighbours and let them know that they can't control the fire, and then they'll contact us as well. We don't normally respond to all fires. We just don't have the capability, but we might talk through the landholders what strategies they can put in place. So we effectively cover 98% of the NT, and in that we have the 5 fire management zones, which I've explained, and then the 4 fire protection zones. So the 4 fire protection zones are mainly around the major centres where there's a lot of houses and an infrastructure, and effectively in there you have to have a permit to do any mitigation burns all year round. On top of that, there's the 21 emergency response areas, which is NT Fire's responsibility, and that, again, they're around the centres around the place. Yes. So the decadal event, and I'm no scientist, but over the previous 50 years, pulse events of large intense wildfires have occurred roughly every 10 years following the La Nina conditions. Central Australia is arid to semi-arid, containing desert landscapes and typically infrequent growth events with disconnected fuels. In arid Australia, fuels are at their highest following a period of high rainfall events of at least 400 millimetres that fall 1 or 2 summers earlier, coupled with a wet phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. These situations have been demonstrated to occur in 1975, 2001 to 2, and 2010 and 11, when rainfall was greater than 400 millimetres. Led to significant fire events in the region. Conditions in the lead up to the event were similar to those experienced in previous above normal fire seasons. The previous 2 years of rainfall had caused spinifex and shorter-lived grass fuels to develop and connect across great distances. Conditions were drying out with reduced rainfall and higher minimum and maximum temperatures. Added into this in the recent years is the spread of buffalo grass across Central Australia, and that was an introduced species that certainly grows very, very quickly. We noticed this year in particular that some of the areas that we burnt last year had grass back on them within 2 to 3 months. Yes, thank you. So this gives you a picture of some of the history. The 2011 fire scar in green showed you how much territory burnt in 2011, one of the decadal events. 2019 is a typical year with most of the fires in the top end. And then 2023, obviously that's what we had last year. I expect this year will be down a little bit, but still have had a lot of rain, and there's still a lot of fuel out there. So either we'll get a late run and a lot of that southern area will get burnt, or it'll all burn again next year. Next. This gives you an overview of how significant our season was last year compared to others. It just gives you the average amount of, these are all wildfires too. They're not actually planned fires. So we had an extraordinary fire season, 903 wildfire incidents that we managed, compared with 472 in 2022. And for the first time, all areas within the Northern Territory are under a fire danger declaration. So yeah, we basically the whole of the territory, which is pretty hard to spread, 37 people. In late October 2023, there were 43 going fires across the Northern Territory that we were managing, and they were affecting basically every major transport route. Today, and I'll talk about it later about the CAS, but yesterday I was a bit concerned about where all my resources were, and they were sitting idle. Today we're looking at something like 40 fires across the territory that are pretty significant for us. Next slide. So the timeline for the Barkly fire, the pre-season preparedness, we knew it was going to be a bad year. We tried to engage with landholders, but we can't force pastoralists to go out there and do mitigation. We can't force them to put in fire breaks. All we can do is advise them to do that. It's up to them if they choose to. We did look at preparing Tennant Creek, but we came into some hurdles there. We were going to go and look at existing fire breaks and do some mitigation work, but we were told that we couldn't do that until an anthropologist had a look at all the existing lines, and they advised us that probably about 2 weeks out from the fire starting that we were right to go and we could go and do our burns from there. So it's a little bit too late. Coupled with that, we had some issues throughout the season with we were trying to do mitigation burns and we were getting sporadic rains. So all the burns we were trying to do couldn't get done till late. We actually lost a car in the middle of the Barkly for about 6 weeks because the crews went out to check a line and got bogged and we couldn't get it back out. So it just shows the complexity of trying to do these burns in that area with the differing weather. So stage 2 for us was 28th of August to the 11th of September, where the initial ignition started, and then the 2 fires joined together, and then they started moving towards Tennant Creek on the 8th of September. Yep. So stage 3 for us is 11th of September to 15th of September, when we actually had an emergency declaration declared, mainly because Tennant Creek was under threat. And so we had a whole of government response to that. Yep. Then stage 4, we had a community south of Tennant Creek called Canteen Creek. We had to go into asset protection down there as well. And we actually mobilised 2 single engine air tractors from Darwin down into Tennant Creek on about the 8th of September, I think it was, which we've never done before. We've never taken aircraft down that far south, which proved to be a bit of a logistical nightmare, getting crews and water and all the rest of it down there. And then we mobilised down to Canteen Creek to protect Canteen Creek. Then we made the decision to demobilise out of the area and let the fire go. And then from the 5th to the 12th of October, that fire, and I'll show you the schematic in a minute, was backing towards some cattle country. And then we had to put a final push in, which was about a 250 kilometre backburn, which we had to prepare before we did it. So actually putting a grader through to do that in pretty terrible country. And then post-event recovery, which I won't go into too much today. Yep. So this is come from NAFI, which is pretty important to us. We monitor this every day to see where fires are, and you can hit play for this. So that basically shows 4 million hectare burnt out at the time that this was done. That just shows the spread of the fire around Tennant Creek, and then the run towards Tennant, and the backing fire as it heads towards the east. If you look down the bottom right-hand side, you'll see the backburn that we did to finally pull it up. And that's just, as you see that at the moment, that's an overlay of the area that it had compared to Canberra. So it's nearly 12 times the size of ACT in the end. Next slide. So this next video, it's schematic, will show you what fires were going on from August, and you hit play right through. And the Barkly fire, yes, it was a big fire. It certainly wasn't the biggest one for us that last year. And this will quickly show you how much country burnt in pretty quick time. Now, in this area, there's not too much infrastructure out there. There is a couple gold mines that are pretty significant for the Australian economy. And all I could spare was two of my staff members to go up there, but the gold mines themselves brought in people from interstate to protect them. And you see the bottom right-hand side is the top end of the Barkly fire as it went past Tennant Creek. So yeah, fair bit of country burnt. Next slide. So our response initially, we just supported the landholders, and then we went into protection of Tennant Creek and then protection of Canteen Creek. Then we had to make the decision to withdraw, just through fatigue and working out what was our effort worth the reward. Pretty hard decision to make, to walk away from a fire, but you know, in the end we just had to do it. We just couldn't be there as long as we wanted to. And there was a fallback about 70 kilometres south of Tennant Creek that we were going to look at doing. But then we realised there was no point because there's 70 kilometres of unburned bush between Tennant Creek and where we were going to burn, and all it took was one person to light that up, and the fire would have raced up to Tennant Creek anyway. So we just let it burn, and then we just made some decisions later. At one stage, I asked what would it take to actually pull this fire up, and it was going to be a 500-kilometre back burn, which we just said we can't do it. There's no way. So like I said, we walked away, let it burn for a while, and then we did that final push, and in the end, that was a 250-kilometre back burn just to pull it up. Next slide. So part of the way through, my executive director, Colin Bremner, reached out to NEMA. They sent a team up and they did a crisis analysis and strategic planning for us, which was really, it was great for us in that we could use that to go to government and say, we're not just sitting here being alarmists. This is actually happening, and this is going to cause us some grief. And it gave us a lot of cover with government to say, we're spending a lot of money, but this is why. And I'm spending money now, and I've got NEMA actually in Darwin at the moment doing an analysis for me to justify why I'm spending all this money having assets deployed around the NT. And like I said, they were idle yesterday, but they're going to be busy today. There's a fire actually going up towards Tennant Creek today that we're pretty concerned about. So, and they're calling for additional resources. But this is just a snapshot, and we got them to do it twice for us, and it's just a really good tool for us to show that we are in a world of hurt, and this is what could happen. And yeah, like I said, it was really good for briefing government. Next slide. So I won't go through all of these, but there's a lot of lessons we learned. Fatigue management was a big one. We had crews working well past 20 hours. They were driving 6 or 7 hours to get to a fire in the first place, and then having to come back home. Communications was a huge issue, always is. Using the aircraft down there. It was funny, I had one politician ask us, why don't you get that big plane from interstate with the pink stuff and go and bomb it? Try and explain to them in the middle of the fire that, that's going to cost us $300,000 or $400,000, and it's only going to put a line of pink stuff for a kilometre. It's not really that effective towards, and then we have to send it back and get another load. So yeah, just a few distractions for us. Road closures is a huge issue. We just don't have the resources to do it. And when you're talking 200 or 300 kilometres between townships, and then trying to stop people going through there, I ended up closing the Barkly Highway for 3 days and tried to get people through whenever I could. But when you've got people backing up over 3 days to the Barkly Homestead, which is just a petrol station in the middle of nowhere, or Avon Downs Police Station, which is effectively a police station in the middle of nowhere, you don't have any support for those people. And so getting the message out, don't come, or don't go down there if you don't have to, or telling cotton trucks, don't drive across a Barkly with your load exposed because you're likely to catch fire. We had two trucks about to put out in the middle of the fire. So yeah, a huge issue for us given the distance, and there's no telephones or mobile coverage in those areas, so it makes it really hard to get the messaging out. Next slide. Oh, sorry, we'll talk about rate of spread, which has come up on the screen now. We don't normally use it in the top end because our fires are only 2 or 3 hours and we get on top of them pretty quickly. We've started to use this a lot more, and it was really useful, and I apologise for the quality of this slide, but it was really good for us to brief the police and all the other government agencies on, if we don't do anything, this is what's going to happen to Tennant Creek in the next day or 2 days. So we've been using it a lot more this year, and we've been sharing it with the pastoral stations around the place so that they've got some idea of what they need to do, because if they don't, this is what's going to happen. So they love it, and they've been very appreciative, and a lot of our work this year has just been putting these rates of spreads out. Next slide. So at the moment, we're very close to having, we commissioned a review of the Barkly fire. We expect it to be pretty scathing of us as an agency, simply because we don't have the capacity to do what they suggested we could do. These are the three gentlemen that came up and did the work for us. Both Danny and Nathan have served as an IC previously in Darwin, so they understand the complexities that we face. But I think, we don't know if the minister's going to release it, but it's currently with the minister's office at the moment, and then we're hoping in the next couple of weeks that it'll get released publicly, or certainly parts of it. Next slide. So some figures. At one stage, we estimated we probably graded 18, or not just us, but the pastoralists, 1,800 kilometres of grader work in less than 4 to 6 weeks on just in the country. You try and tell the government we're going to grade from Darwin into South Australia in 4 to 6 weeks in one single lane, they'll laugh at you, but that's what we did. We had over $120 million in cattle north of the Barkly Highway, which we weren't aware of, but we did in the end work that out. So we realised we had to step up. Normally, like I said, it's the landholder's responsibility, but knowing that we had $120 million worth of cattle sitting there, we really had to step up to protect that, because that industry, if it had gone over, would have been pretty bad for the whole country. The two backburns were at least 200 kilometres. We shut the Barkly for 3 days, which had huge impact on trucking and all the public. Next. Keep going through them to the end. So we reckon we had about 500 people directly involved in the response. We had over 200 volunteers come up from interstate. It was nearly 12 times the size of the ACT. It was the 2023 season, more than 42 million hectares of the land had been burnt. Most days, 30 to 40 fires. Like I said, today we're monitoring 40. We lost one unoccupied homestead, and there was no deaths or serious injuries. So to me, it was a big success. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see the country, that one fire, burn out. Next slide. I think that's it. I'd just like to acknowledge a few people. I wrote it down here somewhere. Maggie Towers, who put the report together on behalf of us. Obviously the Bushfires NT staff and volunteers that assisted. All the NTG staff from external agencies, including NT Police and Fire, South Australian Country Forest, CFA, New South Wales, RFS, who sent a whole heap of people up, NAFI, NEMA, and particularly the community around Tennant Creek and the rural community. They did an amazing job under some terrible conditions and in some of the most remotest places in Australia. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And that was remarkable. And you probably haven't had any reason to look in the chat. So I'm just letting you know that there's a huge amount of support and humility going on in the chat, given the sheer scale and complexity of what you've just been describing. So thank you very much for that. That's a very compelling case study. Sincere thanks to Darryl, Joe and Tony. What fabulous presentations. Now I'm just going to launch straight into questions and see if we can fit a couple in the time we have left. For those of you who still want to vote for a question, I am literally going to start with the most popular ones. The first question does say, and I'm not quite sure who to direct this to, this could be a comment from any of you, is there a lessons management approach to assist the learnings from the report so that it's embedded and actioned across the sector? Now, I'm going to take a punt first and say, actually AFAC put together a lessons management forum every year. AIDR are often involved in hosting or supporting it. And there's a whole lot of lessons sharing and lessons learning that goes on in that national forum. But would anyone like to add anything to that, to answer that question from a major incidents report point of view or from a NEMA point of view? Joe, you're on mute. Apologies.
Go again. Thanks, Margaret. Just quickly jump in there. Absolutely support what you've just said around, working with AFAC and others. But NEMA has also a really strong focus on lessons, and we've really got a big focus on real-time lessons, so applying the oil in real time so that you're actually adapting. And the key thing about the major incidents report is, whilst it's not a purist in terms of the oil methodology, that's still what it looks at. So what are the observations, what are the insights, and then now have a look at it and say, so how do we apply that into our systems? Thanks. Back to you.
Yep. I've got did anyone else want to add? Otherwise I'll launch into the next question. I've got an interesting question here about the 3G network shutdown. So that's clearly affecting a lot of rural and remote areas. So Megan has asked, does anyone anticipate particular impacts of shutting down the 3G network in terms of getting messages out to rural and remote communities?
I can probably answer that as well. Being directly involved. Obviously, the telcos have shut it down. They've replaced it with 5G. Their commitment is that it will have the same. So where there was 3G coverage, there will be the same level of coverage. The key issue is around making sure that the handsets, anybody that had a 3G handset, there are programs to actually change over those handsets. But as far as coverage is concerned, and I have to qualify this, as advised by the telcos, that they have replaced the 3G coverage with 5G.
Thanks, Joe. Now, there's a question here about warnings and information. Clearly, as David says, warning and information are critical beyond consumption. Is there high quality evidence that people act on advice? This is a very complicated question, David. Sounds simple. Anyone want to have a go at that?
Do you want? I'll let somebody else go first, Margaret, but I'm happy to jump in there.
I'd be interested in a territory view, Tony. How do we work out if people actually, because I have examples in my head where some people do take advice, they take it very quickly and they move early and it's all sorted, and other people ignore advice. So got any comments from a Territorian point of view?
Look, yeah, we're pretty used to disasters up this way, unfortunately. So most people do, but the issue for us is the distance and coverage. We're talking, there's no mobile coverage on the Stuart Highway except for the major centre. So you can drive 2 or 3 hours and not know what's going on down the road from you. So we did engage some interpreter services, and a lot of our messages went out in language, particularly around Tennant Creek, Canteen Creek and those areas. So what impact that had, I'm not sure. We haven't done any studies on it. But at least we got it out there and people were aware. We particularly did it around when we were using bombers, water bombers in Tennant Creek, so that we didn't have community members walking out and getting hit by 3 tonne of water. So which was really important for us because they'd never seen them in action before. So it was pretty important for us to get that message out to make sure that people stayed away from when we're doing the water bombing acts. Around Tennant Creek, which we actually did in the middle of Tennant Creek.
So many challenges in this work, and as many people said, so many challenges because of the sheer size that you deal with, Tony, of country. It's no consolation, but I travel on a train from Ballarat to Melbourne to come to work, and I go through spots where there's absolutely no mobile coverage. How about that? Anyway, I'm very sad to say that we are completely out of time. I'm going to take us 1 minute over, I think. So I do apologise for that, everybody. Darryl, Joe, Tony, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been a very rich presentation, very rich. I would also like to just thank a couple of people from an AIDR point of view. Darryl, I sincerely thank you as our writer. It's no easy task to herd the cats of various wonderful contributing people and agencies. I would like to thank Kirsty Bryden from NEMA for coordinating the Australian government content. Thank all of the jurisdictional reps for their content and the other organisations that have been involved. And finally, a thank you to the AIDR team for project management and for production of the report. If you haven't seen the report, have a really good look at it. It's well worth a read. On behalf of AIDR, thank you for joining us all today. You will be directed to a short survey on your way out. Please fill it out for us. We actually really do use that information to tailor our events for you. It's been my great pleasure to host you all this afternoon. So until we see you next time, stay safe and farewell.